in San Francisco, and welcome to our September webinar. Hope you all had some good summers and look forward to hearing about them next time we're together. So we're really excited to have Amanda back with us today. All of you who attended our June meeting will remember her well, I'm sure. Just a reminder, so is from John Snow Incorporated. She is a research monitoring and evaluation advisor in visual analytics, and her is very passionate and excited about the intersection of data, design, and communications. And I know from synthesis of the feedback from the June meeting that her session at that meeting was very highly by many of you, and that we all, myself included, got a great deal from that. So really excited to have her back. Before we started with her presentation, we just have a couple things to go through. So the next slide, basically what we're hoping to do in the next hour, have some quick updates, continue our learning about how to tell stories using data, and look ahead for the upcoming year. So, as I think you all have now heard, we're very sad to see Denise go, but we're really excited for her and the great opportunity she has up in the Twin Cities. And we are thrilled to have Todd Boyette joining the evaluation. Most or many of you already know Todd. He's been very active in the Science Festival arena for many years. If you haven't yet met him, it will be a joy when you have that opportunity. And here is a brief bio. So Todd is currently the director of the Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center at UNC. He has been in that role since 2006. He, along with Denise, is a co-founder of the North Carolina Science Festival. In addition, he's worked in science museums for many years. He has a PhD in science education, and he's a former high school chemistry teacher. So we're really pleased to have Todd joining us. Todd, I don't know if you want to say anything for the group. Emma unmutes you. You want to say a welcome?
Yes, welcome. Thank you, everybody, for allowing me to participate. I've been supportive and interested in this project from day one when Denise and Karen and Catherine started talking about it several years ago. I'm excited to take on this new role. I stay in touch with Denise, so no balls will be dropped, that's for certain. I'm very pleased. I am a huge advocate for science festivals and the role that science festivals can play in the communities that they serve, and I believe EvalFest is pivotal as we all struggle in trying to figure out exactly what is happening with the audiences that we're serving through science festivals. And I know EvalFest will help inform the field as we try to answer those questions. So I'm very excited. I look forward to working with you. I've met most of you when you were here for the first annual meeting in Chapel Hill a couple of years ago. I look forward to working with you more closely over the next few years on this project.
Great, thanks, Todd. Next slide. We want to just give a couple shout outs to our new mini grant awardees. We have a mini grant awarded to St. Pete, who will be doing a time and tracking observation study of their festival, plus Indian River Lagoon and the Jackson Festival. Congratulations also to Arizona, who will be doing a Q study to learn more about what both attendees and festival partners feel they get out of the festival. So congrats to those teams, and we look forward to learning with them in the upcoming year. So now just a couple things to keep you up to date. So several things. We have a list here of looking at. This is the next slide. I'm going to just it says, okay, so we are in the process of creating chart templates for you to use. This is from Karen. For those of you at the annual meeting, all of the chart types that we presented will be converted into a template form, so you can plug your own data into those. So hopefully that will be of interest to many of you. We also asked at the survey at the end of our annual meeting, how much interest there was in statistics training. Many of you are interested in statistics training, and we are looking into options for how to offer that to the community. The leadership team is meeting with NBT next week, and we hope from there to have an updated dashboard that we can share with you during our November webinar. And that webinar will be part of a hands-on session where we can spend time really digging into our own dashboard pages. And then next month, the October webinar, we are really excited to have John Besley as our presenter. John specializes in science communication, and he will be talking with us specifically about whether and how we can generalize from the sample sizes that we gather at our festivals. And so we had actually hoped he could join us in June. He wasn't available at that time, but we're really excited to have him for the October webinar. That will be October 20th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And now, let's turn it over to Amanda. Thanks, Amanda.
That's great. Thanks. All right. Hi, guys. I'm really excited to be joining you again. I had a great time working with a lot of you at the meeting in June, and the request for this follow-up session, I think, came a bit out of the interest of a bit more of a deep dive and looking under the hood at how to go about actually taking data points you have and crafting them into stories, and like what are things or tips or tricks you can use to develop stories, since not all of us are really natural-born storytellers. I'm Amanda McCulloch, as was mentioned. I am a visual analytics advisor with John Snow Incorporated. It's a public health research and consulting firm. And I want to go ahead and start today by actually focusing on talking about the science behind stories. I know a few of you were really excited about stories at our workshop that we did, and some of you, I think, were a bit more skeptical about why use stories and put that extra time and effort in. So I want to talk about how the science of stories really starts in your brain. I mean, stories are powerful, and they're powerful for reasons related to neuroscience and things perhaps a little bit more complex than some of us realize. Because stories prompt our bodies and our brains to produce hormones that create a response in us that actually help us connect with information and ideas in ways that we can't if it's just presented to us in a more kind of linear, standard, intro methods to results conclusion type format, which is what many of us, especially who work in science in different spaces, are really used to seeing. Because I am not a neuroscientist and perhaps can't debunk any skepticism you might have, I want to actually pivot over and show a video from Paul Zak, who is a neuroscience teacher, professor who studies storytelling and studies the impact that stories have on us. So I'm going to pivot over to Mr. Zak and let him tell us about various ways in which stories actually not only have an impact on our bodies and on our response, but also can have an impact on how people choose to give you money, which might impact some of you guys who are interested in fundraising and using storytelling to go ahead and gain new funders.
I want to tell you a story about a little boy named Ben. Ben is 2.5 years old and has brain cancer. And Ben's really happy. He's happy because he's been through 2 rounds of chemo and radiation, and he feels good for once. He doesn't feel yucky, and his father's enjoying seeing Ben's happiness. As the father tells the story of Ben and his cancer, the father's voice begins to break. And he says, it's very difficult to play with Ben because Ben thinks everything is wonderful, but I know something that Ben doesn't, that Ben's dying. And he talks about how difficult it is to play with Ben, knowing that in 3 or 6 months, Ben will be dead. And yet Ben is so happy, he's so beautiful, and so the father tries as hard as he can to Ben, to be joyful around Ben, but then he says in the middle of this short story that it's an amazing thing to know how little time one has left. And as he says that statement, he has merged himself with his son. It's as if the father himself is dying. So in my laboratory, we've studied this story extensively. What we found is that two primary emotions were elicited. One is distress, and the other is empathy. At the same time, when we asked people what they felt after the story was over, we really couldn't get very clear answers. So we began doing other studies on this story. So we took blood before and after, and we found that the brain produced two interesting chemicals. One is called cortisol, which focuses our attention on something important. So cortisol correlated with our sense of distress. So the more distress you felt, the more cortisol you released, and the more you paid attention to that stimulus. The second chemical release is called oxytocin, which is associated with care and connection and empathy. And oxytocin was correlated with people's sense of empathy. And the more oxytocin released, the more empathic they felt towards Ben and his father. And we did something different after this experiment. We gave individuals a chance to share money with a stranger in the lab. And indeed, those who produced both cortisol and oxytocin were more likely to donate money generously to a stranger they couldn't see in the lab. In another experiment, we gave individuals a chance to donate money to a charity that works with children who are ill. And indeed, those who released oxytocin and cortisol donated money to this charity. In fact, the amount of oxytocin released predicted in both cases how much money people would share with a stranger or with charity. What we're seeing is that this narrative is changing behavior by changing our brain chemistry. So we decided to go a little further and ask, could we predict before they watched the video who would donate money to charity? So with funding from the Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, we reran the study in which we not only took blood, but now we measured heart rate and skin conductance and respiration. And using these additional measures, we were able to identify this distress response and this empathic response, and we could predict with 80% accuracy who would donate money to charity. These individuals get paid about $20 to be in an experiment, and the people who donated money on average donated half their earnings. So we began to investigate this story further. We used functional brain imaging to identify the regions of the brain that were most active while watching that video compared to others.
And so we're not going to go into the very detailed neuroscience and all of the little brain scans that go with that. But as you can see from that video, after hearing a story that follows a specific arc and really engages and prompts your body to engage and respond, researchers could actually predict contributions to a charitable cause related to that story with 80% accuracy, which is saying a lot, and saying that they would give about usually half of what they were being given back to a charitable cause. And so for any of us who work in any way connected to fundraising or new business development or anything else, thinking about how storytelling can actually help us not only improve how we actually share what we're doing, but we also can increase how we actually gain funding is a pretty powerful motivator for investing some time in telling better stories. So I want to run through 4 basic types of stories, which we also talked about at the EvalFest session together. But first I want to talk about the dramatic arc and what kind of runs throughout these stories, which starts with exposition, this idea of introducing someone to a character or an idea or a place, this introduction to something or someone. And then feeling this rising action, that something happens, you're going ahead and you're getting motivated and you're moving towards something, you're on a path or a journey or taking new action, something is actively happening to that person or idea or place that you've been introduced to. And then hitting a climax, where you hit that point when there's a big point of action, there's the big tumultuous battle that happens at the middle or end of a movie, or there's the moment at which someone has their big aha moment where they're engaging with a science festival exhibitor and they're excited and engaged and they're like, wow, this is really changing how I think about science. And then falling action, how do you actually wrap up those activities and come back to a calmer place, and finally denouement, or the ending of that story. And that dramatic arc from Tate from about 150 years ago is something that, as we talk about different ways you can frame or think about stories that you might use as ways of framing your own stories, any story you follow that follows this kind of dramatic arc is really excellent and really a great way to go ahead and focus on how to go ahead and engage people. So the first of the 4 kind of anchoring stories is the story of me as an individual, my story, my narrative about my experience. So perhaps my experience walking into and engaging at a science festival as a person attending or as an exhibitor. Then there's the story of us. Us as an entire group or collective group or organization. So that could be all of the participants or a group of participants together at a festival or exhibitors at a festival, their shared collective experience. Or even the organizers, and these are organizers of, I learned from my last trip, a South African science festival. I was in South Africa last month and was surprised to see that they also have a robust science festivals culture. But the story of us as a group, how have we as organizers or evaluators overcome obstacles and done something amazing and awesome in our work? There's the story of an idea, the story of a specific idea, a scientific concept, a way of going ahead and working, but a story of a specific idea that gets people excited and engages them. And the story of results, which we often actually have happening when we're doing our evaluation reporting, is we're talking about the results and what we learned. But we can frame those within the narratives of people or within the narrative of an experience that can create a more engaging way to share those results with others. In many of the great stories, the stories of mythology and the stories that we see that have a lot of archetypes in them or archetypal plot lines, we see wonderful themes, and those themes and those ways of telling stories have meaning embedded in them and make people think and feel in different but somewhat consistent ways. So you can have a coming-of-age story, the way in which your science festival started very small and you went ahead and you grew, and this was the big year for you. And it demonstrates that you have arrived and shows experience and demonstrates strength. You can have a story of how you overcame obstacles, where there were challenges but you really came out ahead, which shows resilience. So if you were facing a challenge around funding, or you had a year where your venue totally fell through and then you had to recombine at the last minute, a story about that kind of experience shows resilience in how you organize your event and how you engage with your participants. You can tell a story of constant evolution, where you see that things are always changing and growing. This is where you're pivoting and taking into account what's coming out of those evaluations and finding ways to evolve your events further so that you're doing new and interesting things that engage your participants in new ways. And that demonstrates your adaptability. You can tell a story of how things are true as it ever was, where you remain true to yourself and your core values. Maybe there were challenges that you faced and you decided to keep on the straight and narrow and take your festival or your events in a certain direction. And to do this shows steadiness and helps to reinforce trust between yourself and your audience who's listening to you tell this story. There's the story of rebirth, where you've grown and changed and reinvented yourself. Perhaps you had an instance where in your community there wasn't a science festival for a few years and you brought it back. And that can show new hope and direction and promise and get people excited about engaging with this new version, this new and improved version of the events and the community that you're creating. And one of the most common and ones we talked about most is the quest, this big hero's journey and the quest that you make, where you're making a long and perilous sometimes journey through which you remain true to yourself and, again, your core values. And talking about this quest shows commitment and dedication. And while all of these things might feel like, why are big archetypal stories relevant to me? As I started thinking about how I approach thinking through stories and developing stories, I wanted to share some of these ideas as ways that if you're feeling stuck, you can say, you know, how could we frame this story? And even just thinking about what the goal is and what you want to demonstrate can be a starting place that can kick off a great brainstorm session or a different way of thinking about how you frame your data. We talked also when we were at our session about the Pixar Story Arc, which is one of my favorites because it involves fill in the blanks. When you're starting with a blank sheet of paper, sometimes fill in the blanks are the best possible thing you can have. So this is where you say, and how Pixar uses something like, once upon a time there was Nemo, and every day Nemo and his dad left the anemone to swim around the reef. But then one day, Nemo got lost. And because of that, Nemo met Dory. And because of that, Nemo and Dory went to Sydney. And because of that, they ended up in an aquarium until finally Nemo was reunited with his father. And this Pixar story arc is one that carries through many of their movies and the way that they frame stories, but it carries because it resonates. And you can see it follows that dramatic arc in its own way that gives you little prompts to fill in. It starts with introducing you to a character. And then it talks about that, it gives you that rising action of kind of what's kind of the thing that always happens. And then one day, something really big and exciting and important happens, and it's a little bit crazy. And then because of that, things happen, and because of that, things happen. That kind of gives you that falling action until finally things are okay again. And so that kind of story arc can be a helpful starting place when you're feeling lost on how you can frame your data with a story. I would encourage you, though, as you start thinking through different ways of crafting data-centered stories, and I promise we'll get to data in a minute. I just wanted to really focus on the story piece to start. To focus your story on what your kind of key messages are and the audience you're connecting with. A lot of times when we start to try to craft narratives around our data, I think we try to make stories that are everything to everyone. And instead, you really need to focus on what it is you really want your audience to take away from what you're sharing and the story that you're telling, to make sure they focus on that key data point. So let's break down kind of storytelling and story building into sort of kind of components. And I'll be leaving behind a worksheet that has these components and that dramatic arc built into it as a template that you can use as you're trying to brainstorm on building new stories. But I would encourage you as you start this process to always go ahead and focus on harnessing your inner child. We all told great stories and ridiculous stories when we were 2, 3, 4, 5. I haven't had a child, so maybe 2 is a little bit early to start, but we all told great stories and had no fear when we were younger. And sometimes breaking down those walls and not hesitating and not thinking in the same boxes of the 500-word theme or our introduction, methods, results, conclusions approach can really be liberating as you try to find creative ways to engage in your new audiences and tell the story of your festival and tell the story of what you've learned from your evaluations. So instead of me just dumping boxes at you, I thought instead we'd walk through a quick little practice round to again take that kind of under the hood, how could this work for me approach, and maybe it'll be something that sticks for you. I have made up everything that I am sharing here in terms of data and situations, but hopefully it'll be something that resonates at least a little bit. So here's where we are. Your festival is pitching for a financial contribution for next year to a family foundation who's really interested in supporting activities that expose women to careers in STEM. For those of you who participated in our workshop in June, you'll see that here we have very specifically who your audience is, Family Foundation, and their specific interest, supporting activities that expose women to careers in STEM. And your goal and your call to action is that you want to walk out of this meeting with a commitment for a financial contribution. So we've laid the groundwork, and that's where we are now. First, I would start with looking at what your key data points are in your dashboard, in your evaluation results, in your special micro studies from your micro grants. What are the key data points that you have that might resonate with this foundation as we try to think about what are the key things we want to share? So some data that we might have at our festival. 3,000 people attended it this year, 1,200 of them were women. The number of women increased by 40% compared to last year, which might be of interest because it demonstrates continuous engagement and recruitment of women to come to the event, since this is a foundation interested in engaging with women. You had 78 different exhibit booths that created opportunities for interaction, and a third of those exhibitors were female scientists. So you're not just engaging women who are coming to the event and then not seeing anyone like them there, but rather you're letting them engage with scientists who are much like themselves. They can see themselves in those roles. 90% of women said they interacted with the scientists when they attended your festival, which is exciting and is a great space for talking about how you create the space for engagement. And 4 in 5 women attending said they were exposed to a new career path in science, which might be the thing that's most important for you to share with that foundation, because they're really interested in exposing women to new career paths. I know this might feel a bit canned because we have that data point and it says exactly what we wanted to say, but hopefully you can bear with me for the sake of illustration. So once we have looked at our data, we also want to think about looking for surprises in our data, or data that we might not immediately think is relevant, but that might be really intriguing for our audience. Because big stats and big numbers that impress people, big successes are great, but we also want to find surprises that might also be relevant. So say, for example, we found that 57% of male attendees who interacted with a female scientist left with an improved perception of women's capabilities in STEM careers. And we somehow could say that it's not just about engaging and interacting with women and getting them excited about science, but rather also shifting the perception of how women can hold critical research or other leadership roles in science. So that could be a surprising data point that we might want to integrate into our story. Next, after you've got your data points lined up and you've kind of slimmed down to what your core data points are that you want to share as part of this story that you're building, you've got to think about who your characters are. Who are the different characters who could be part of this story as you go ahead and think through how you go ahead and present this not just as data for data's sake, but data that's rooted in people and people's experiences, people's feelings, people's knowledge. You want to find ways to connect those data points to different characters, and I'm just using characters to describe different groups of people who could be groups like female exhibitors in this case, running with our example. Maybe the foundation's interested in hearing about female exhibitors. Female attendees, who would be the target audience, so very interesting to this kind of foundation, but also perhaps organizers or evaluators, and what has your experience been? For organizers, this narrative could be you highlighting a story about the ways in which you're thinking about how you engage with and do outreach to and recruit women to come. Could actually be a really compelling narrative to demonstrate, again, going back to those archetypes, that story of constant evolution, that you're looking at the data you're getting back and using it in a meaningful way to actually change and pivot how you design your festival and promote it and do all the different engagement connected to it. You then, once you have your data and your characters, have to line up what's the point of view you're taking when you're telling this story. Is this going to be a story that's told from the perspective of an individual, for example, one of your attendees? Or is this something where you're bringing your unique point of view of your lens as an organizer? Which kind of point of view do you want to take? You can use a voice that you have in your data already if you've collected qualitative data and have a good illustrative person or story, something that comes out that's very specific and real and anchored in someone's real actual experience. And that's more what happens when we have ourselves speaking as evaluators or speaking as organizers, talking about our data. But you can also create this aggregate voice that's meant to represent multiple people. So this is where you start thinking about, if you remember from our workshop, the idea of personas, like an illustrative person who represents a group of people. So perhaps you want to represent how you're attracting and recruiting young women to come to your festival. You could create an aggregate voice for that group of young women that feels more personal because it's being told as someone's individual story. So let's take Layla. This is not actually someone named Layla, but let's take Layla as an illustrative attendee, someone who's coming to your event and who kind of fits the profile of one of the people that this foundation's interested in connecting with. Once we have Layla as our voice and our point of view, and we have the group of characters who we've data, you have to pick what story you're going to use to frame your data. And this is where focusing on how you actually use that dramatic arc, and also how you actually can go ahead and use some of these story archetypes can be really helpful and beneficial. So I gave you a long list of different archetypal stories for the Pixar story or these stories of me. But if anything like this feels too complicated or like too much, you can always just go back to that dramatic arc and think about how you can build a story that starts with that introduction and then goes into the rising action, the big climax, the aha moment, the falling action, and the denouement. And you'll find that even great storytellers at places like TED use that same kind of dramatic arc to engage you in the process of them telling their story and getting you to feel their aha moment, and usually with some pretty good visuals. So let's go back to Layla. This is Layla, and this is going to be her story about her experience going to a science festival, because we want to use her story, Layla's story, to convince this foundation about the benefits that can be created for young women like Layla by them investing in your future festival activities. So we start building and creating. I have deliberately made a very messy, weird, ugly storyboard that will hopefully give you, again, a look under the hood. The fact that this isn't some kind of beautiful process that just comes out of someone's brain and onto a piece of paper. But this is something that's usually iterative and that can be done collaboratively with team members as you create and craft Layla's story. Think as you're building that story like you're looking through a kid's book. Kids' books are great inspiration for simple stories because they're always visual for the most part, and they naturally progress slide by slide or page by page as you're going ahead and reading through a kid's book. Anyone who's read a book to a child knows that they'll quickly get bored if there's too much text for each page. So as you're kind of thinking about how we go ahead and we build a story, think that way. When we're thinking about building a story and we're thinking about visualizing a story, successful data visualization has story or concept as a critical part of doing it well. And so you have to have your data, your information. We talked about the fact that we need data. You have to have a story, which includes characters. So we've talked about picking a story and characters. A story of me told by Layla about the group of people she represents. You got to have a goal. This is the goal of convincing this foundation that you want that by investing in your work that they will be furthering their own goals. And then there's the visual forms and metaphors and how you actually visually illustrate that story in a meaningful way. So my first step whenever I'm building out one of these kind of stories is to build a storyboard, and I often do that either on paper first or sometimes in PowerPoint. So I find it to be a useful collaboration tool. Also Google Slides if you're on the Google Slides, because that way you can collaborate together with your team and figure out how that story actually fleshes out. So let's go ahead and start thinking about how we'd storyboard a story about Layla's experience. So when we walk into that room with that foundation, we might want to start with what we want them to know, which is really that our recent festival event, Layla was one of the 4 and 5 women, and we can talk about Layla being illustrative, who attended the event who said they were exposed to a new career path in science, which is exciting for that group. And now we're going to use Layla's story to explain why that happened or what her experience was like, and bring in some of those data points that we showed earlier to go ahead and reinforce some of the points in Layla's story. So this is Layla. I'm Layla, high school senior, and heard about a science festival when a friend posted about the event on Instagram. Great. When I arrived at the event, I was amazed to see how packed it was. So we have kind of a blank slide statement. We could go ahead and here add some data about how many attendees we had. This is where we can start sketching in new ideas. So here's where we could say Layla was one of 3,000 attendees. I was nervous to go, a feeling, we have to invoke feelings, right? Because events like this intimidate me, since it's usually all dudes. But I bumped into a few girlfriends who had also decided to check it out. And here's where we can highlight the fact that the number of women attending increased by 40% at this year's event, which was really exciting for someone like Layla to walk in and see other people like her and bump into some friends. We decided to check out an exhibit table that had a set of microscopes set up across it since it didn't have a long line. So talking about her experience. Not every single point in a story has to have specific data attached to it. You can here add in a visual of like a map or a floor plan or something else. But just talking about Layla's experience and what did she experience when she walked in the door. The woman behind the table explained a bit about her work in microbiology and helped us take a swab from inside our own cheeks. We got to check them out under the microscope and learn about cells using our own bodies. Now, this is trying to create a space where Layla's getting excited. Like, why is this exciting, Layla? This is new and different, and she's talking about it being women who are explaining it to her, which is really exciting for her. We meandered around the exhibit floor for a while after that, but definitely didn't have time to stop at every booth, which is where you can highlight the volume of exhibitors who you have. With 78 booths, 2016 was our biggest exhibit hall to date. I'm heading off to college next year and haven't figured out what I want to major in. So it was really exciting to learn about some new careers I didn't even know existed. And here's where you can pull back in a number like 4 and 5 women who attended who said they were exposed to a new career path in science. And so you can see that you can kind of bring us through this arc of who Layla is, that she decided to attend the event. She got there, she felt nervous. We have a feeling evoked. She got excited about engaging with someone at that exhibit booth and that exhibit table and what that meant. And now she feels inspired to think differently and learn more about new careers in science. Then we could wrap up and say, you know, our science festival is a great way to expose women to STEM careers. But we also want to point out it has a big impact on how men perceive women's work in science. In our evaluation, we found that 57% of male attendees who interacted with a female scientist left with an improved perception of women's capabilities in STEM careers. So it's not just about connecting with the women who are attending, but also improving how different men think about women in science, which is really exciting because it takes everyone together working to go ahead and improve how many women are really feeling inspired to go into STEM careers. So I would pose to you, and I'm not sure the easiest way to do this, maybe with the chat window or chat function, I'd love to hear your ideas on how we can improve this really, really rough story. Where are the places that we can add more data, or do you have ideas on how we could add more visuals to go ahead and make the story more compelling about Layla? And Emma, I'm going to defer to you on the best way to facilitate those responses if we have any. Any ideas? So let's go back through this a little bit. If we go back up, there are a couple things I could think of we could do. So we start with the storyboard. We could go ahead and add some kind of visual here about the number of people who were attending. We had 3,000 attendees that filled the floor. Here we've got a nice easy kind of comparison stacked bar, but there are other ways we could show this kind of increase of 40%. You could use a slope graph or a different kind of graph or charts. There's lots of options. Talking about the exhibit table that had the microscopes and didn't have a long line, this is kind of talking about the experience of one of your attendees, but you could have them visualized as how they're kind of walking through a map of the actual exhibit hall going from table to table. And you could maybe use that as an anchoring visual as part of the overall visualization. You could have a picture of the woman, and here you could really highlight that data point about the fact that 1 out of 3 of the exhibitors were women, which is really exciting and I think speaks to the engagement of women in as exhibitors. And here you could go ahead and you could create a bigger icon matrix, or you could show how your exhibit booth has grown over time, but keeping things pretty simple. And again, closing out with this key point. You also, to integrate this point about men a bit more, could go ahead and bring it back up into the main story by talking about the fact that Layla bumped into one of her male friends while she was at the event, and he commented on the fact that it was really cool to see all these women scientists, and then point out that 57% of male attendees who interacted with the female improved perception. So there are lots of ways that you could start thinking about tweaking and moving this around, but by having it in this storyboard format in PowerPoint or another format, Post-it notes are just as good. You can actually move things around and do things in different ways, which is really nice. You can even pivot this and decide that Layla's not the right voice for the story when you start thinking about it. You really think the more compelling story is maybe about you as an organizer and how you've been able to go ahead and engage and recruit more women to come to your event. But only by starting to brainstorm and just come up with rough cuts and quick ideas for stories, I think, can we really see what sticks and what we feel like we need to tinker with and change. But you can see how this draws on having started with the data, the characters, the point of view, and then picking what kind of story we're going to tell, and then starting to layer those pieces all together, kind of like building one really big, tasty sandwich. The one thing I would say as you're building out your stories and thinking about how you communicate about your work is to really try to be authentic as best you can. I think authenticity is something that's a hot topic today, especially with our presidential election ongoing. And the idea that to really be authentic is really important because it's what helps to actually make it seem as though you're not telling something canned or made up. You also have the opportunity there and try to give voice to the voiceless. I mean, this is where you can try to be that voice for someone who might not be able to advocate for themselves. Perhaps if you're trying to go ahead and craft stories that tell the story of people who don't always attend science festivals, the unreached populations. But be authentic in what you're crafting and creating, and test your stories with different people. Tell them to your colleagues and see, or even better, go tell it to your kids at the dinner table and see if they tell you that they're excited or they're bored. In terms of reading recommendations on storytelling specifically, I would suggest looking at Resonate, Nancy Duarte's book, looking at StoryCorps, and also this great Skillshare class called Storytelling for Leaders. That's all around crafting stories that matter. Some of these archetypal ideas and things are coming from that Skillshare class. So I'd highly encourage you to check that out as an easy way to keep building your storytelling abilities. And in terms of favorite things as you start to visualize stories and add visual pieces to stories, I would suggest using sites like Pexels. That's where a lot of these high-res photos come from, along with Unsplash, which is now aggregated into Pexels, which is nice, and the Noun Project for getting free icons and symbols. Because sometimes the simplest and easiest ways to start building out these stories and story ideas end up being by giving them simple illustrations, whether they're really simple decluttered charts or graphs, or they're more larger high-resolution images or icons. But I think by just starting from a simple place of building out what that storyline is and then starting to add in graphics, it'll get you to a place where you might at least have a nice slide deck, and then you can start thinking about how things would fit together visually on a single page. And I will promise you that if you take a simple storyboard like that that has those key story points, along with simple visuals to a graphic designer, and you're working with them, they will be thrilled to have such concrete content that they can work with to visualize that story into something that's beautiful and easy to print. I wanted to leave a lot of adequate time for any questions that you guys had. I know I didn't go into specific data visualizations a lot today because we had a lengthy session on that at the workshop, but I'm happy to field questions about data visualization, resources, storytelling, whatever's related to this webinar or seems to be more related to my broader job. But I really appreciate you making the time to join me for this session today. I hope it was something that sparked some new thinking for you. And starting to think about where you can incorporate stories, even in the smallest of ways, into your work, whether it's just with short intros to PowerPoint presentations, or it's in how you go ahead and start a pitch or start a talk with a new donor. It doesn't have to be everything that you share with someone, but a story is really a way to connect with someone in their heart and their mind, which is really powerful. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my formal presentation and leave it for questions, and I think I see some blinking lights.
All right, so if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will unmute you. I see that Amy has raised her hand, so I'm going to unmute you.
Oh, hi, Amanda. This is Amy Pierce, and I was at the conference, this summer and had the pleasure of being there to hear your presentation then. I got your example, that you just shared with everyone. I'm just wondering, and really this is a question for other people with SFA or ICSEC or EvalFest, if they have used this, if you have one, a storyboard, that other festivals have used.
Great question. I am happy to share this really simple one that was kind of canned from my rough knowledge about science festivals, but would love to hear if there are other folks who might have something they could share, or a story that they've done in this kind of style.
Okay.
If I'm still unmuted, what I'll just add is that, yes, I'd love to try this, and I'm just wondering if anyone has any feedback, on their experience.
Yeah. And Amy, while we're waiting for other hands to go up, I will say that if you want to see some examples of other more kind of evaluation results or technical results translated into stories, I'm happy to share some of those that aren't Science Festival related, though I know that's your direct question. But if you'd like to see some other ways that those have been crafted both as a story but also visually, I'm happy to share some of those if that would be useful. And I can send those to Emma to circulate. But I know the stuff that's topical and relevant to your specific area is usually what's most helpful.
Anybody else? And Amanda, if anybody does have follow-up questions after the webinar, would it be okay for us to share your contact information, or how would you like us to go about that?
Of course, happy to have my contact information shared. I think it's also at the last slide of the deck. But I will share the deck, and I also, as we're kind of, I guess, wrapping up since questions are simple, I've got a pretty simple kind of template for you to use if you want to, as something you can play with. I know that sometimes it's nice to just have a big sheet of paper to brainstorm in that has this on the front and a storyboard template in the back with the dramatic arc plugged into it. So I will also send this around to you guys so that if you want to go ahead and use it as a brainstorming tool, hopefully it can be an easy place to start as you're starting to think about incorporating more storytelling in your work.
Great. Kaya says, when do you think it is more appropriate to share the stats versus sharing a more qualitative story?
To share what was the first half of the thing, qualitative stories versus?
Versus sharing stats. When is it more appropriate to share stats versus qualitative?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's one that comes up a lot in terms of not wanting to seem fluffy, if that makes sense. So I think that for me, it all depends on who the audience is and how well I know the audience who I'm speaking to and what is going to stick with them. when I'm trying to go ahead and make a case, say, to a funder. In my formal proposal, I might be more specific and narrative around focusing on stats, but in a pitch meeting, more time to go ahead and tell a short story that brings some of those statistics together. That's one of the reasons I was pulling some of those data points into the story. And you could even craft the story differently, that you tell more of a story of, you know, we were facing the challenge that we'd had really low attendance from women last year. And so we brainstormed collectively as a group of organizers about how we could go ahead and address that issue. We came up with a series of really interesting and innovative ways that we addressed that problem, and we were able to go ahead and increase the attendance of women by blank. And I know that that's a little bit more kind of typical, kind of what you might write in a report, but by breaking it out and bringing in the narrative with the stats, I think it's really valuable. But I think it's all about knowing your audience and what's going to stick with them, really.
Great.
Amanda, there's a couple questions from Karen. This is Catherine, but Karen typed in a couple questions. One is your thoughts on whether it has more impact if you use pictures instead of icons when you're telling your stories, photographs, I'm assuming.
Depends on what you have access to. I think it varies. I think that if you have really good high-resolution photos that illustrate and bring to life what you're saying, so if you had like a really great photographer at your science festival who can use, and you can build a series of photos, or if you can think in advance about the stories you might want to tell and maybe be a bit purposeful about the photos being taken. So if you know you're going to want to share the journey of what was it like for one of our younger attendees, can you get the permissions and the sign-off and the approvals and everything else that's required for just consent to use someone's image to go ahead and actually kind of photo document what their story is. Another really unique way of telling a story through a curious point of view can be to actually give cameras to kids or to younger participants and ask them to document their experience, and then use those photos or images to go ahead and actually demonstrate and tell their story. Because then it's really uniquely from their point of view, not something that's them in the frame, but what they're seeing through their own eyes. So when it's photos, I tend to go that direction. Icons tend to be a little bit easier to access and quicker, so depending on what you have access to, they can be a simple, easy fill-in. But it just depends on what you have access to and what consent forms you've gotten signed for all the pictures, and if you've got the right ones.
Right. She had another question saying, if you are an external evaluator, are there limits to how you can use stories ethically? When does it tip from reporting to promotion?
It really depends on who the audience is and what the product is. I don't think that in a formal kind of final evaluation you would tell an illustrative story to frame everything and kind of create that story from scratch. I mean, it's a really great framing narrative for if you're doing an external presentation to explain what you do at your festival or something else like that. But I think that when you're thinking about it from an evaluator's perspective, I mean, you have to think about the rigor of the data and not misrepresenting it. And one of the challenges in storytelling is that when you change things in the narrative, oftentimes you lose some of the rigor of the indicators and how the questions were framed. So I think you have to find a balance, and you have to think about what the product is and where it's being used. And so I think that becomes a really critical piece of where it's really nice if you can capture real stories, to be honest, when you're capturing more of that qualitative feedback and information, and how you can build more of your story points in an evaluation report that's a more formal, methodologically sound document, something that you actually can go ahead and share and use. So I would definitely say it depends on the product, the audience, and where it's also I'm thinking about making sure that you're true to what the data is actually saying.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. That was really useful, and Karen said so as well.
Yeah. Hard, because I think tell better stories, but I think it's hard sometimes to when you didn't think in advance about the fact that there might be some interesting stories you want to tell, and you didn't it's like planning an evaluation, right? If you don't think in advance about what are the kind of things you're going to want to measure later, and you don't collect the data in your baseline, it's really hard to go figure out the answers to how you impacted certain indicators later, right?
Yeah, right. And sometimes you don't know until afterwards. Oh, I would have liked to have known this. Or,
Yeah.
Yeah, just to explain to the group, Karen is typing and not speaking because she's in a noisy cafeteria or noisy room somewhere. Any other questions, comments? Any hand raising? Okay.
I don't see anybody.
I don't see anybody either. Well, thank you so much, Amanda. It was great to have you join us again. Yeah, I really appreciated getting to build on what we started in June. So thank you.
Of course. And I'll send all my materials to Emma, to everyone who's listening, or for people who didn't make it. And if they want to go ahead and you want to circulate those, Emma, I'll leave that to you, okay?
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Amanda.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.